Was stirring a pot of tomato soup on a Tuesday afternoon when my uncle sent me a voice note. He didn't usually send voice notes. He preferred texts, short clipped ones, usually asking for something. So when his name came up on my screen and it was a little audio bubble, I almost let it sit. I was in the middle of making lunch for Grandpa, who'd been home from the hospital for 3 weeks by then and still couldn't manage stairs on his own. I pressed play. Hey, just letting you know I got access to the account. Transferred what we needed. Dad won't even notice. He thought he was sending it to his wife. He sent it to me by mistake. I stood there with the wooden spoon in my hand, soup dripping onto the stovetop, and I read his name on my screen one more time to make sure I wasn't confused. I wasn't. He had sent it to the wrong person. And in 12 seconds of audio, he had just told me everything. The thing about my uncle is that he's always been the charming one. Funny at family dinners, first one to offer a toast, the kind of guy who remembers your birthday because he has it saved in his phone with a reminder. My grandpa adored him, called him his right hand. When Grandpa's health started going downhill 2 years ago, the heart stuff, then the fall, then the longer hospital stay last winter, it was my uncle who stepped in to help manage things. He lived 40 minutes away. I lived 12. But somehow, he became the one Grandpa trusted with the finances. I should have pushed back on that earlier. I know that now, but I was 29, working full-time, and I told myself that my uncle was older and more experienced and that family was supposed to trust each other. Grandpa had set things up before his first hospital stay. A joint account for day-to-day expenses, a separate savings account that was meant to stay untouched unless there was a real emergency. He'd also updated his will and had a lawyer draft documents about who could act on his behalf if he couldn't make decisions for himself. My uncle's name was on most of it. Mine was on the savings account. Just mine. Grandpa had done that quietly, without telling anyone else. I found out at the lawyer's office the first time, and I remember feeling surprised and a little overwhelmed, and I didn't say much about it to anyone in the family because I didn't want it to become a thing. I think looking back, that Grandpa knew something I didn't yet. For the first year after he set everything up, nothing unusual happened. My uncle would check in, pay the property tax, make sure the internet bill was sorted, that kind of thing. I'd visit Grandpa 3 or 4 times a week, bring groceries, drive him to appointments. We had a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Then Grandpa had the bigger health scare. He was in the hospital in Hamilton for almost 6 weeks, and something shifted in my uncle during that time. I noticed it, but I couldn't name it. He started asking Grandpa questions about the house, not in a concerned way, more in a cataloging way. What did Grandpa pay for it in the 80s? Had it been appraised recently? Did he know what houses on that street were selling for now? Grandpa would answer, happy to talk. He liked talking about the house. He'd raised 3 kids there, including my mother, who passed when I was 17. That house was everything to him. He'd told me more than once that he wanted to stay there until the end, and that after he was gone, whatever happened to it was fine with him as long as it was handled fairly among the people he loved. My uncle started talking about investment opportunities. A property he and his wife had been looking at in Kelowna. How the market there was doing things nobody expected. How it would be a shame to miss the window. How Grandpa's savings were just sitting there not doing anything. Grandpa told him the money wasn't for that. My uncle backed off, smiled, changed the subject. But I kept noticing things. An email notification I saw over Grandpa's shoulder one afternoon, something about an account activity alert that Grandpa dismissed without reading because he finds the email interface confusing. A conversation my uncle had on the phone in Grandpa's kitchen when he thought I was in the other room, where I heard him say, "We just need the right timing." A comment from my aunt at Easter about how they were finally moving forward on something big. None of it was proof. All of it was a feeling. I didn't say anything to Grandpa because I didn't want to alarm him and I didn't want to be wrong. He'd had 2 cardiac events in 18 months, and his doctor had told us that stress was a genuine risk factor. I wasn't going to walk into his kitchen and tell him I suspected his son of planning something, not without something solid in my hand. So I started paying closer attention. I set up account alerts on the savings account I was a co-holder on. Anything over $200, I'd get a notification on my phone. I started taking photos of the account statements when I visited, just the totals, just so I'd have a record of what the number was supposed to be. I made a folder on my laptop. I kept notes, dates, things I'd heard, amounts. It felt a little paranoid. I told myself I hoped it stayed that way. Then Grandpa went back into the hospital in January. Not an emergency this time. more of a planned admission for a procedure. But he was there for almost 2 weeks. And while he was there, the alerts started. The first one was for $400, then $800. Then, 5 days into the admission, a single transfer of $11,000. I called the bank the same evening. I explained I was a co-holder on the account, and I needed to understand what was happening. The person I spoke to was helpful, more than I expected. They couldn't tell me everything over the phone, but they confirmed the transfers and they told me there had been someone calling in on the account using the primary holder's information. My uncle had been calling in as Grandpa. I went to the branch in person the next morning. I brought the folder, the notes, the screenshots of the statement totals, the dates. I spoke to a manager. I told her I believed my grandfather, who was currently a patient at the hospital, was being financially exploited by someone with access to his personal information, and that I was a co-holder on the account with documentation to show a pattern. She took me seriously immediately. I don't know if I expected that, but she did. We spent almost 2 hours going through things together. By the end of that meeting, the account had a security flag on it. Any future transactions above a minimal threshold would require in-person verification with 2 pieces of ID. Transfers initiated by phone would be suspended entirely, and the bank's internal fraud team was being notified. She also told me, gently but clearly, that I should speak to a lawyer. I called a lawyer that afternoon, a woman I found through the Law Society of Ontario's referral service, someone who specialized in elder law. I explained everything in about 20 minutes, and she told me I'd done the right things in the right order, which made me cry a little in my car, in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons, because I'd been holding it together for weeks, and apparently that was the sentence that broke through. She helped me understand what the next steps were. She also helped me understand what my uncle had likely been doing, using Grandpa's personal information to authorize transactions over the phone, slowly, in amounts that might not trigger immediate alarm. The $11,000 was probably him getting more confident. The total that had left the account in the 3 weeks before I intervened, just under $22,000. I went to visit Grandpa in the hospital that evening, and I sat beside his bed and I held his hand, and I didn't say anything about any of it. He'd had a procedure that morning. He was tired. He wanted to talk about the Leafs and whether they'd managed to do anything meaningful before the end of the season. Probably not, I said. He laughed. It was the best sound I'd heard in weeks. I went home that night and I transferred the entire remaining balance of the savings account, just over $47,000, into a new account that only I had access to. I called the lawyer first to make sure I was doing it correctly, that I had the standing to do it and that it would hold up if anyone questioned it later. She confirmed that I did. She also told me to document the reason for the transfer in writing, which I did, a simple note that I saved and sent to her as well. The account my uncle had been calling into was now empty. I want to be honest about how I felt that night. Not triumphant, not even relieved exactly. More like hollowed out, because this was my family. This was my mother's brother. And what he was doing, systematically stealing from a 74-year-old man recovering from a heart procedure, it broke something in me that I'm not sure is fully healed. I didn't sleep well. I made tea at 2 a.m. and sat at my kitchen table in Brantford with the folder open in front of me, and I thought about what it meant that I'd been right. Because part of me had spent months hoping I was wrong, hoping the voice note was a misunderstanding, hoping there was an explanation. There wasn't. Grandpa came home from the hospital on a Thursday. I picked him up, helped him get settled, made sure his medications were organized. He seemed better than he had in months, actually, lighter somehow, more himself. He wanted to know if I'd eaten. He made me sit down while he heated up some leftover beef stew he'd asked his neighbor to put in the freezer before he went in. We sat at his kitchen table and ate beef stew, and he told me about a nurse on his ward who'd reminded him of my mother, and he teared up a little, and I teared up a little, and we didn't say much after that. My uncle showed up 2 days later. He came on a Saturday morning, which was unusual. He typically called first. He had his wife with him. They were dressed like they were going somewhere nice, which also struck me as odd for a casual visit to Grandpa's house. I was already there when they arrived. My car was in the driveway. I saw my uncle's expression shift just slightly when he noticed it. He was warm. He hugged Grandpa. He brought coffee from a place in Burlington. He made small talk about the weather and asked about the procedure. His wife sat across from me at the kitchen table and smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. After about 20 minutes, my uncle said he wanted to help sort out some financial admin while he was there. He said he knew Grandpa found the online banking interface confusing, and he brought his laptop to help walk through a few things. Grandpa looked at me. I don't know why he looked at me first. Maybe he'd sensed something too over the past months. Maybe he'd sensed something too over the past months. Maybe it was nothing. I said, "Actually, I took care of the account stuff a few days ago. Everything's in order." My uncle's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Oh, what do you mean?" "The savings account," I said. "I moved everything to a new account. Security reasons." The bank flagged some unusual activity. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when everyone in the room is very still. "What kind of unusual activity?" he asked. "Unauthorized transfers," I said. "Going back about 3 weeks. The fraud team is involved." I watched something move across his face. He recovered quickly. He's always been good at that. He said something about how that was concerning, and he was glad I'd caught it, and he'd been meaning to talk to Grandpa about those transfers actually. He'd needed to borrow some money temporarily, and he'd meant to mention it, and he was going to pay it back. Grandpa set down his coffee mug. The sound of it on the table was very quiet, but it stopped my uncle mid-sentence. "You took money from my account," Grandpa said. He said it like a statement, not a question. Like he was just saying the words out loud to hear how they sounded. "Dad, I was going to tell you, while I was in the hospital." My uncle started talking faster. About the Kelowna property, about the timing, about how it was a loan, and he'd fully intended to make it right. About how I was making it into something it wasn't by involving the bank, $22,000, I said. The number landed in the room like something physical. My aunt stood up and went to the window. My uncle stopped talking. Grandpa looked at his son for a long moment. I don't know what he was seeing, something he'd spent a long time not wanting to see maybe. "You should go," Grandpa said. "Dad, I need you to leave my house." They left. "Dad, I need you to leave my house." They left. My uncle tried twice more on the way out. Once directed at Grandpa, once directed at me in the doorway. Something about how I'd poisoned the relationship and how I needed to think carefully about what I was doing. I closed the door. I went back to the kitchen and sat next to Grandpa. He was looking out the window at the backyard, at the old silver maple he planted the year my mother was born. His hands were flat on the table. "How long did you know?" he asked. "I suspected for a while," I said. "I didn't have anything solid until January." He nodded slowly. "I kept hoping I was wrong," I said. "So did I," he said. We sat there for a while without saying anything. Outside, a cardinal landed briefly on the maple and then was gone. Grandpa watched the spot where it had been. He asked me later that afternoon if the money was safe. I told him it was, all of it, and walked him through the new account details. I told him about the bank and the fraud team and the lawyer. He listened carefully, asked a few questions, and then said he wanted to change his will. I called the lawyer on Monday. The fraud investigation is still ongoing as I'm writing this. The amounts involved: $22,000 taken, the intended target of the $47,000 remaining, have been formally reported to Hamilton Police Service. My uncle has been interviewed. Whether charges come from that, I genuinely don't know. The lawyer says the case is clear, but the process is slow. Grandpa is doing well. He has a new cardiologist he actually likes, which is a minor miracle. He's been sleeping better. His neighbor comes by 3 times a week, and they watch old hockey games together and argue about statistics. Last week, he called me on a Wednesday for no particular reason, just to talk. He asked if I'd eaten. He always asks if I've eaten, and I told him I'd had leftover soup, and he said that counted. I've thought a lot about the voice note, about the fact that it was sent to me by accident, that if he'd sent it to his wife like he meant to, I might have spent more months suspecting without knowing. I might have been too late. And I think about that not because I want to feel lucky, but because I know that in a lot of families, there is no accident. There is no moment where the truth lands in someone's hand uninvited. There's just a slow draining and an old man who trusts the people he loves, and nothing left to protect him. I'm glad I paid attention. I'm glad I kicked attention. I'm glad I kept the folder. I'm glad I walked into that bank branch on a January morning with a stack of screenshots and a feeling I couldn't quite name. I'm glad Grandpa looked at me first, across the kitchen table, before my uncle could say anything else. He knew. Maybe not all of it, but enough. And I think he was relieved that I knew too. I keep coming back to the silver maple in Grandpa's backyard, the one he planted the year my mother was born. He still looks at it the same way, like it holds something he doesn't have words for. I think about the fact that he'd been sitting at that kitchen table for years, trusting the people around him, and that trust was being used against him quietly, in small amounts, in phone calls he never knew were happening. That's what gets me. Not the anger, though the anger was there and it was real. It's the quietness of it. The way betrayal like this doesn't announce itself. It just takes slowly from someone who never thinks to check. I've thought a lot about what made the difference in this situation, and I don't think it was luck, even though the voice note felt like luck when it landed on my screen. The truth is, I'd already been paying attention for months before that. I'd already kept the folder. I'd already set up the alerts. The voice note confirmed what I already suspected. It didn't create the outcome. I did, by choosing not to look away when everything in me wanted to. There's something I've come to believe about doing the right thing when it's inconvenient. It costs more than people expect, and it pays more than people expect. And both of those things are true at the same time. Sitting in that bank branch for 2 hours on a January morning wasn't easy. Calling a lawyer and explaining my own family situation out loud wasn't easy. Sitting across from my uncle in Grandpa's kitchen and saying the words I said, that wasn't easy either. But I think doing hard things with honesty is how you stay someone you can live with. My uncle made a different choice, and I watched it change his face when the money wasn't there. That's not a punishment I arranged. That's just what happens when a person builds something on a foundation that was never theirs to build on. I also think about how much of this depended on actually understanding what was happening, on knowing enough to ask the right questions at the bank, to keep records, to reach out to a lawyer instead of just hoping it would resolve itself. I was 29 and I didn't know everything, but I knew enough to take the next step and then the next one after that. I think that kind of knowing, practical, grounded, the kind you build by paying attention, is one of the most protective things a person can develop. Not just for moments like this, but for every time life asks you to hold something important without dropping it. And then there's the part that I think about most quietly, which is simply that I didn't quit. I spent months feeling like I was probably overreacting. I had no proof for most of it, just a feeling in a folder. I kept going anyway. When I walked into that bank and the manager took me seriously, I almost fell apart, not from relief, but from realizing how long I'd been holding my breath. Staying steady through that kind of uncertainty, when you don't know if you're right and you don't know if it will matter, is something nobody tells you is hard, but it is. And I think it's worth doing anyway. Grandpa called me last Wednesday for no reason in particular. He asked if I'd eaten. I told him I had. He said, "Good. That's enough."